Back in the early 80s, I was, as I am now, a keen reader of Doctor Who magazine in its earlier form, Doctor Who Monthly. There was a long-running, long-format comic strip featuring the Fifth Doctor called Time and Tide. And it was illustrated by Dave Gibbons, written by Pat Mills, as all the best strips were. And reading that, watching the story evolve, as my Doctor was sort of taking his first real steps on the TV screen, it was a really special time for me. And Doctor Who seemed expansive and exciting in a way that it certainly had never been for me before, that I'd witnessed. Everything seemed clean and fresh and new, and a lot of it seemed unknown as well. A great deal of that came from a couple of key appointments and bold creative decisions. There was names on title sequences that, for years I had no idea who those people were, what they looked like, how long they'd been involved, anything about them really. So even the names in title sequences had a sort of romance and mystique about them. In time now, after we've read so many books about the history of the show and been served some of the best documentaries I think any fans of any TV show could possibly wish for on the DVD and Blu-ray ranges, we know a lot more, and we can put faces to the names, can't we? And the byproduct of that, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, is a real sense of loss when anyone connected with the show, not just the stars that get all the adulation and the attention traditionally, not just them, do leave us. That happened again when it was announced that Christopher H. Bidmead, the writer and script editor from the classic series, had passed away a short time ago. This was announced by his family, 84 years of age. In 1980, Bidmead partnered up with revolutionary young producer John Nathan Turner as his new script editor throughout season 18. Season 18 began broadcasting 45 years ago, just this last weekend too. A hugely significant time for Doctor Who that got everybody to sort of sit up and pay attention, really, due to the combined efforts of these guys and those huge creative changes to take the show through to the 80s. Like many script editors, he would contribute stories himself. He escorted the commanding Fourth Doctor off into the light, really, and to reveal his breathlessly curious successor there, before taking that Doctor and his companions to the catacombs under the surface of a war-torn world in the far future. Imaginative stories, idiosyncratic tales, all brought to us by Christopher H. Bidmead. There's lots of hype, would you say? Notoriety. There's lots of myth. I think myth is the correct word, Anthony, that's sort of attached to this name. I mean, the fact that he's got his middle name is there, the H in the middle of it, that also adds mystique. Like Russell T Davies, what does the C stand for? What does the H stand for? Somehow it makes somebody sound that bit more big-brained, or even that slight distance away from us. And as a kid, I just assumed, because when I saw this man's name on the credits as something that he'd written, noted he was the script editor, that the stories themselves would be not necessarily, were they more intelligent, or were they just looking at Doctor Who, the character and the universe, from a completely different place? What's your take on that, Anthony?
I have to say, Dan, that was a really nice introduction to this part of the show. I was kind of listening to what you were saying, and I couldn't agree more. This was a different time for Doctor Who, wasn't it? Because Tom Baker had been the Doctor for such a long time, and like you, I didn't know anything else. I'd got a few Doctor Who books. There were some pictures. I had the Doctor Who Monster book where you could look at old pictures of old Doctor Who's, but I'd never seen them on television. So this was an important time for being a Doctor Who fan, because this was the first time we were going to see a regeneration. I I think when this first went out, and you're absolutely right in saying that Leisure Hive episode 1 went out 40 years ago, just this weekend. I don't know if I liked it when I first saw it because it was so radically different to, I was 9 years old and enjoying, I think, what Chris Bidmead would say, the silliness of Douglas Adams. Silly was his middle name. And I was kind of quite enjoying that silly Doctor Who. It'd been very different from the Hinchcliffe and Holmes era of Doctor Who. It was very different, but I was still enjoying it. It was fun. City of Death is there, and people would argue one of the best Doctor Who's there's ever been. So when Christopher Bidmead came along with John and Barry Letts as executive producer, you felt that something was going to change. And I was at school watching a schools program, and they said, "Oh, we're going to have a listen to the new Doctor Who theme." So it's like, gosh, this is good, isn't it? Middle of the day at school on that big television they used to trundle in, watching a program about, the new Doctor Who theme. And I absolutely hated it. And I thought, this doesn't feel right at all. So it's interesting now in retrospect how much I loved this particular series, but the 9-year-old me would have been lamenting the passing, I think, of the Douglas Adams silliness that was going to develop in this series.
It was a massive change that people were talking about. Doctor Who had sort of looked the same and felt the same for quite a long time, and I think it had gradually got more sillier. Let's be honest, it had gradually got sillier, and the production had started to look a little sort of threadbare. But obviously, we didn't really mind. In some ways, that was the nature of the beast. But my God, when the new version of Doctor Who really started to take flight, most obviously, let's say, crashing into that new credit sequence, it did make people sit up. Okay, they are serious about taking this show into the 80s, into a new decade, and about telling instantly with the Leisure Hive, that telling stories that they maybe either hadn't for a while or hadn't even dared to before, and concepts that were very, very imaginative and seemed sort of anchored in a science which at the time seemed like sort of gobbledygook to me. But I think Christopher H. Bidmead and the various writers who worked on that did strike a nice balance. I never felt distanced from the show at all. Bidmead was an English screenwriter, script editor, and respected journalist, best known for his work on Doctor Who. He'd been recommended for the job by Robert Banks Stewart, who'd written Terror of the Zygons and The Seeds of Doom, wasn't it? So just a couple of stories.
Yes.
Up until then, Bidmead had been writing comedy for Thames TV in tandem with articles for these sort of big-brained scientific journals. It's yet another of those characters, Luke, like Douglas Adams, like Robert Holmes, Malcolm Hulke, who seem to have led the most unlikely lives. You think, how on earth did they find their way to writing for this Saturday tea time adventure show?
Yeah, it's a mad world. That's the glorious world of film and TV. 1 minute you're working on this, the next minute you're off to something completely different. But I thought you absolutely smashed it as well. I went back and I watched Legopolis and Castrovalva this morning, and I was like, oh man, this is that was very well timed up. Fair play. It always amazes me how well you do this. Like every time it just catches me off guard. But yeah, no, I thought if Douglas Adams was doing very whimsical, silly sci-fi, he brought it back to very hard-nosed, real science fiction, and it was refreshing to see. And I thought Legopolis is an out-and-out classic, isn't it? It's not just because it's Tom's last one as well, and the Master's back, but I thought, it's nice to delve into, harken back to towards the original. I thought, where it is an educational show, when they delve into the science a bit more, when they're going into it, and not be so fantastical. And I just thought, I haven't seen Frontiers as much or as recently, so I can't comment on Frontiers as much. But again, I watched these two this morning to refresh me, and I was just like, these were fantastic bit of writing as well, and Castrovalva as well. As I always slipped under the radar for me, and I watched it back this morning. I was like, this is just so good as well. yeah, it's a real shame. I think it started doing the rounds on Friday. I think it did that. It came out because Toby Adoki tweeted it, and everyone's kind of like, oh, okay, well, this is real then. So yeah, it's very sad. But his memory will live on in his writing, and long may it continue.
John Nathan Turner was such a larger than life figure, not just his dress sense, Gary. Christopher Bidmead, on the other hand, seemed quieter. He looked like a computer science teacher. He looked like he would probably hang out with Sir Clive Sinclair, Alan Sugar, the Elon Musks of their day, I suppose you could say. So he wasn't showy in the same way, but he must share equal amounts of the credit, I suppose, for the reinvention of Doctor Who in the first place in 1980, and then to take advantage too of the fact that the star was departing rather than back away from it. It must have been hard on both of them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I understand that him wanting, I mean, having the background in being a computer like magazine journalist, that I understand his excitement at wanting to kind of take the show back to a more disciplined kind of, back to the kind of like science education / entertainment remit from the show's origins. I get that. And there's an argument to be made. Did that necessitate them tossing out all the humor and whimsy, which is, to me, is distinct from silliness? I get that, but that doesn't necessarily necessitate tossing out all the humor and whimsy. But be that as it may, I do think that his approach was very valid. He wants to introduce concepts that can be entertaining at the same time as educational for children. And the fact that he can, and again, like Luke, I rewatched Legopolis and Castrovalva last night, and then Frontios this morning, and it's great how he can explain to children how a computer works by having them envisage it as chanting monks arranged among the streets of a city, or that he can explain evolution depicted as kind of a somewhat dubious change from spiders to marsh creatures to humanoids. But even so, that's a way to kind of introduce the concept of evolution and or the idea of recursion, as the Doctor looking out a window and seeing the town as a shattered mirror, or with a simple drawing of a map inside of a square where every building is somehow there 4 times. It's not simplistic, but it is a way to introduce these hugely complicated concepts to children, in a very entertaining way. And, with Legopolis, it's great that how he can ground the very cliche idea of, the entire universe is a risk, which has been overdone on every show, including Doctor Who. But he can take that cliche idea and merge it with a scientifically explained, a scientifically based explanation as to why the universe is at risk, because it's a fundamental scientific principle of heat death and entropy, which is, for the viewers, depicted as the city crumbling around the Doctor and the companion. So he can take all of these esoteric scientific explanations and make them visual and visually exciting and not dry for the young viewers watching. And that takes skill. That really does.
No, I was 5 or 6 at the time, and it wasn't dry for me. But when you look back and when you sort of talk about these stories, Charlotte, you think, well, God, that's not what I'm here for. That's not what I watched Doctor Who for. All that stuff, and yet they managed to pull it off. I mean, do you think kids have got is it that they've got a high tolerance for all that kind of stuff, or do they just, the things that we don't understand as children, we tune it out? Kind of like when you read a book when you're a kid and you don't understand some of the bigger words, but you carry on reading anyway. Do you think it's kind of like that with television? And what's your take on these stories and that sort of that brand of storytelling that Christopher H. Bidmead ushered in?
Well, first of all, I just think the amount of bravery and the amount of skill that, like you said, Tom was going. He was such this sort of monumental figure as the Doctor. the style of writing associated with him and the sort of the look of the show and everything. And they could have sort of been quite tepid, Jay, the new producer, and Big Mead and everybody involved, Peter as well as the new Doctor. They could have sort of like taken baby steps, but no, they went for it. And I think like nowadays, you see so many times in these shows or things that have legacy, people come in and they have no finesse. They have no understanding of if they want to make something new, if they want to bring something forward or have their sort of ideas, it still needs to have the spirit and the feel of what went before. But it has to, but then you can still have that feeling of new, and that's what you said about these stories, that you definitely felt we've got harder sci-fi now. At the time, you got the youngest actor in the role that they'd ever had, and I think Davidson was quite a sort of out of field pick for a Doctor. He didn't really fit the template, and I feel like there was a big push to have intelligence and have these sci-fi concepts be a core part of the script. So to pull all those things off, it's incredible when you think about it, that they did it so well. And so sort of, like you said, kids, I think kids prefer it when you give them a challenge, actually. And I think there's that sort of risk of, oh, we need to make it simple, or we need to not be too intelligent because kids can't take that in. They might not understand every little part of it, but they can grasp a concept. The core.
I think if the other portions of the show are doing their work as well through the music and the production design and the way that it feels tonally, then that will do some. It doesn't put it all on the scripts, the story, or that kind of thing. I think this sits very nicely, Anthony, in with shows like Sapphire and Steel, which I know were on slightly later at night, but there weren't any sort of rubber monsters at all in Sapphire and Steel. And this season 18 of Doctor Who, Bidmead's his entire sort of time with it was very light on that quota, on that fundamental, one would think, of Doctor Who, and yet it was still frightening, but in a kind of in a more sort of grounded and elemental way, I suppose.
Yeah, don't correct me. I'm not, what I'm saying about that particular season is, as a 10-year-old, it was so very different. And actually, now as much older, I appreciate that particular series for all the reasons that you've all just cited, because it is very intelligent, and actually the production values are significantly different here to the series before, because, as you say, Dan, it was looking a bit rough around the edges, wasn't it?
And they hadn't got necessarily any more money. They hadn't been given like a Disney Plus massive cash injection. I think they'd been given a touch more to do some to change the covers, to change the duvet cover, for example. It's surface stuff. The bulk of the shows, I think they just managed. I think J&T just managed the money slightly better.
Yeah, and I mean, they were being supported by Barry Letts, who was the executive producer on this particular one. And although, according to Bidmead, that Barry had very little involvement, where they did agree was the fact that Barry thought that Doctor Who had become a bit too silly, and so did Bidmead. And that fusion of those two people coming together, I think that Bidmead would say that he was attacking John from the front. And then there would be this other voice from Barry Letts behind him. And the two of them were pincer moving John into a situation by which he was creating the season that we do actually get. And I think that's a good fusion of the old and the new, to be honest. I mean, I love The Leisure Hive. The criticism of the first couple of minutes, with the shot of Brighton Beach. Too long, too silly, what was the reason? But it sets up that year really well. And I, as I say, becoming a fan later on in my years, those stories stand out as, real Doctor Who triumphs, don't they? There's some real goodies in that series, like State of Decay. written
Some
by
great
Terence
stuff.
Diggs. It's a great story, and often gets forgotten perhaps, but full circle as well. I recently rewatched The Keeper of Traken, which I hadn't seen for a very long time. That's a very stylish production. Oh my goodness. Great story. It looks amazing. I love talking about old Doctor Who.
Christopher H. Bidmead trained originally as an actor, played several roles on the stage, television, and in radio, and positively thrived, throwing himself into each challenge. Really, he appeared opposite Dinah Rigg on stage as well in this season. They call them seasons, don't they? At the RSC, there he is in tights with Dinah Rigg, and he would joke about this quite frequently. But he used to complain about the quality of the scripts that he would get when he would work in television. He was a regular on the medical drama, the kind of soap Emergency Ward 10. And I think that was kind of what started him feeling like perhaps he could do better. And when the acting roles started to dry up a little, that was when he transitioned into writing. We do hear this quite a lot, don't we? I think Barry Letts had a similar sort of pathway through, David.
Yes, he did. And how he got into RADA was a wonderful thing. He was on a bus, a double-decker, going to work because he worked at an advertising agency. And the double-decker bus was going through London and central London onto Gower Street. And he looked out the window and saw all these wonderful, attractive women, as he said. And he thought, well, how do I get to meet them? And he realized that it was the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts. And he thought, well, I'll go and ask them for an audition. And he did. And they told him how much it would be. And he said, well, I don't have that money. And they kind of liked him because he was that rubbish. So they offered him a scholarship. And then he got an agent at the end of that. And the agent said, well, I represent Julie Christie. Birmingham rep want Julie Christie. But his agent said, in order for you to get Julie Christie, you've got to take Christopher H. Bidmead as well. And then obviously he did his drama that you've referred to and went into BBC Radio. And he wrote his only ever fan letter to Robert Banks Stewart, who said, and it was on New Scientist paper, and JNT went in there and said, I need a new script editor. And he said, well, I just happen to have this letter from somebody at the New Scientist. Are you interested? And he went, well, yes. And he called him in, and Christopher H. Bidmead said that essentially what happened was JNT led the interview, and there was Barry Letts over in the corner. And he said, well, actually, I don't want the job because I think Doctor Who's a bit too silly. It's a bit too magical. And I think it should be more science-based. There should be rational explanations based in science for this. And he said at that point, Barry Letts suddenly came alive and said, oh, yes, absolutely. So, and that's when Barry Letts took over the interview. And that's when he found his kinship with it. And what I
probably call that an elevator pitch in the 21st century, David.
Absolutely. And he had quite he had quite everything that he did in his career was as a result of him saying, well, I'm going to give that a go, and I'm going to go and see that person and give him this script and say, well, either take it or don't take it. And he said they used to be that intrigued that they would commission it. And he said you couldn't get away with that now. But what he loved to do was a block transfer computation. he said actually he's erroneously credited for it because in Wikipedia and stuff that he invented it. He didn't invent it. What happened was the computer he was using at the time was the first computer to transfer data in blocks. So that gave him the idea about, well, what would happen if you could transfer objects or change objects using that form of block transfer computation. And what I love,
it was a spark that he saw. He obviously saw a way to take a concept like that, which I suppose to him and to audiences, we'd seen a sort of version of that on Star Trek, hadn't we? With the transporters go. So okay, kids would probably recognise that they'd be able to join the dots in between those two things, and we're kind of returning to that founding principle of Doctor Who to inform as well as entertain, which would have almost certainly chimed with Barry Letts, and I would imagine that Verity Lambert and Sidney Newman would have approved as well. And so it does, even though it feels revolutionary in some respects, it feels so Doctor Who too. It feels completely belonging.
I mean, Barry Letts back in the day when he was just producer, both he and Terence Dicks both read The New Scientist to make sure that they were trying to keep in tune with what was, so they could give it a sciencey reason as to what could happen. And what I particularly love about Christopher H. Bidmead and Logopolis is that the universe is being maintained from collapsing in a big heap by old people whispering pure mathematics in a little community and having that beamed out to things, which is a lovely scientific thing. And he wanted to, and you're absolutely right, Dan, with respect to Star Trek, when they've got their techno babble, as they used to call it in their script, they used to have to run it by a scientific advisor to say, is this in court, could this be scientifically explained? Is this scientifically correct? And somebody would go yes or no or stuff like that.
Because even though Doctor Who had scientifically minded and experienced people like Kit Pedler involved before, they never had a scientific advisor as such in the way that Star Trek did or Sequest DSV would in the 90s and things like that. So it's a difficult balance to strike, I think, but they did it admirably anyway, and still kept it fun. Bidmead, I think, was some of his ideas were so visual or refinements of things that we'd had before. He was the guy who came up with the idea, a name for the Master's little gadget that would shrink people and things. He christened it the Tissue Compression Eliminator, which sounds, to some ears, Luke, it sounds like absolute nonsense, and yet it does what it says on the tin, doesn't it? It's sort of clever and it's in its simplicity, and you could sort of abbreviate it to TCE, and that sounds more sci-fi. So you could sort of have it whichever way you liked, really. And that was obviously revived most recently for Sacha Dhawan's incarnation of the Master. He had a lot of fun with that. I'm sure that Bidmead would have approved. But he was fascinated with the TARDIS as well, wasn't he? And he created not just the cloister room, but the cloister bell, the dreaded cloister bell, which we regularly say we hear too much of now. So Christopher H. Bidmead can take the blame for that, can't he, Luke?
Yeah, you can see the stuff that he's my rose from Rose has fallen. You can see the stuff that he's put into the show has lasted the test of time as well. And the Tissue Compression Eliminator sounds a lot better than a sonic screwdriver.
Yeah.
So
he
hated
that as well.
Yeah, the TC, and also as well, he wrote probably the most famous regeneration of all. He did Tom's bowing out, and he did something different as well with the Watcher coming in as well in his explanation, being like, well, the Doctor lives all these different lives at the same time. They're all traveling around. There's going to be an incarnation that will want to come back and kind of help the other one try. Very good at this. Yeah, so the stuff that he's done is obviously left a massive lasting legacy on the show, and he will be remembered forever. And it's just iconic. The stuff that he put out is absolutely iconic as well. So it's phenomenal. It's a shame. It's a shame, but at least we got some classic stories out of him.
The notion of an in-between Doctor, Charlotte, in the way that we'd have with the Valyard or the Dream Lord, or and I wouldn't say it's commonplace now, but nobody would ever think of doing anything like that until Christopher Bidby did.
Well, yeah, because I think Regeneration was seen as sort of this quite thing that was stuck, and that's how you did it. I know every time it was a different sort of look to it, but the mechanics of it were quite set in stone. So for him to basically, like you said, play with that and have the Watcher and sort of have that be part of it, and we've said this before when we talked about that story, there's such this sort of funeral vibe about it. It feels like somebody's dying. And I think having sort of a figure like the Watcher throughout it just adds to that feel. It just makes it, like I said, that scene when you don't know what they're talking about. And I feel like today
We still don't.
And that's what I'm saying. I think a writer today would be so tempted to show that scene with dialogue, and it takes restraint to go, no, it's more effective to have it in the distance, and we as fans sort of imagine what we think the conversation was.
Do you know what it reminds me of, Charlotte? That conversation, you know, when you're, it's sort of like when you're a kid or you're in a workplace and the grown-ups are talking, and you can see them through a door, an office window, or you're too far away to actually hear what they're saying. It's that sort of, oh dear, something bad must be happening because the grown-ups
someone's going to get the sack, or somebody's been shagging someone they shouldn't, or something like that.
It's that feeling of dread, and that story also has that feeling of dread. But I think what Big Me did so well was he understood this idea of how you deliver things is so important in a script, the format and how you do it, because if you just have a character stand there and say a load of gobbledygook with scientific terms and just go blah, 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 like, people, we can't connect to that. We struggle, like, unless you know, or unless you're a scientist yourself, you sort of goes over your head. So we wanted to have that hard concept, but he thought of, like you said, really imaginative, creative, visual ways. So it didn't feel dry, it didn't feel boring. It was actually really creative, and I think for me some of those stories had this almost abstract feel with the designs and the planets and the way things looked. But like you said, as an adult, you look at that and you go, no, actually he's talking about this. So
it never crossed my mind, Charlotte. It never crossed my mind as a child watching Legopolis that all they'd done was simply made a smaller model TARDIS. For me, somehow, through the magic of TV trickery, they had made the TARDIS smaller. And Tom Baker was in that TARDIS. I mean, Christopher H. Bidby was fascinated with the TARDIS. When he wasn't shrinking it down, he was sort of flipping it around, duplicating it, or turning it inside out. And it was one thing after another. And you think, oh, was he just bored? I mean, when you've got a gimmick like the TARDIS, do you really need more gimmicks? Do you need 0 rooms? But it wasn't like that. It was all in line with the themes and the driving story. I think.
Yeah, the difference is it added to. You didn't just see the console room and like the companions' rooms. The fact that you got told about the 0 room, Cloister Bell, the fact that you can go from high sci-fi to that room with the pillars and the ivy. It just sort of shown that the TARDIS is a magic box in so many ways. And I think we need to show that as much as we can. And Christopher, what I find so funny is a guy who was so entrenched with science and so entrenched in that world, I think probably had some of the most, like I said, beautiful and creative and artistic sort of pieces of this shows ever that's been on screen. So it sort of shows that you can be from one discipline, but you can also show so many other aspects. It doesn't just box you in. He showed that if you've got the imagination, if you've got the drive, you can do anything with this show. And I feel like he's one of the best writers we've ever had for that idea.
He wasn't on the show for very long, was he, Anthony? And yet he's sort of notorious in some senses. You know, his reputation went before him. I think that the way that he would look down his nose there through his glasses, is there some element of performance in this? I don't know. But you were lucky enough to interview Christopher H. Bidmead, weren't you, several years ago? What was that experience like? How did you prepare for that? And who was the man that you got to know during that short period of time?
It's a good question, Dan, because we're talking about 15 years ago. So almost what we were talking about at the very beginning of the show about convention appearances and people that hadn't attended conventions. I think I probably saw Christopher Bidmead at the 40th anniversary. I think that badge is probably his badge for that Panopticon event for 40 years.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I think I'd ever seen him. So that was significantly into my convention journey. So I was a little bit worried about him in the sense of I thought he had a bit of a reputation to be a little bit difficult in interviews and hard to, kind of navigate and to get round and to work alongside. So when I did this interview, I think it was for Phantom Films, and there's the pictures. Yeah, great. I approached that with some trepidation. So I spoke to him just before we did that stage interview, and I kind of went through the questions that I was going to ask him. And hopefully at that point, he kind of saw somebody that was going to be quite articulate, and the interview was going to be intelligent enough for him. And he was very gracious. And it reminded me of the time, I think we were talking about this before, when I interviewed Hanif Qureshi, who also has a bit of a reputation for being not particularly kind to journalists, that I felt that this was not going to go as well as I felt it might have done. But because of that kind of preemptive strike I had with him, and we chatted, we got on really well in the hour that we spent probably before and during this interview and afterwards. So lots of the stories that we've kind of mentioned about the sonic screwdriver and about science was some of the things I talked about in this interview with him. And so he was very gracious and he was very kind, and he clearly had a love for the program in the year that he did it. To move away slightly from season 18 into Frontios, a question from the audience, because I've rewatched that interview just at the weekend in preparation for this. Somebody in the audience asked the question about Frontios, and were you proud enough to be asked back, given that you had script edited a whole year of Doctor Who, had sculpted and made it and created it? And he said, "Oh my goodness, who wouldn't be proud to be invited back to write 4 episodes of Doctor Who that were going to be screened in this year, in these months, and it was going to be my show, of course." So not only did he enjoy script editing season 18, but also enjoyed writing Frontios as well. But also, to pick up on Charlotte's point, I created, I don't know if I've got it here. Charlotte, you were saying about being a skilled writer. One of the things I would have spoken to Chris about was the opening lines to the novelization of Legopolis. So I've just scribbled it down, and it kind of has a sense of his creativity and his ability to write. The opening line of Legopolis is "Events cast shadows before them, but the huger shadows creep over us unseen." So, the opening for a book and about what was going to happen in Legopolis, that kind of foreshadowing. He was a truly skilled writer. And in that
wrote characters well.
I enjoyed the time I spent with him. Yeah, it's great. Very lucky.
He wrote characters really well as well. I know in our previous, when we were doing the review of the episodes on the Saturday nights, we were often quite cold and critical of the ancillary or the supporting cast as to how we weren't invested in them. Auntie Vanessa is probably on screen for 5 minutes at the most. And I can't speak for everybody here on the panel, but I was heartbroken. I still am when she is murdered.
Yes.
And you know, the Monitor. Oh, what a character the Monitor is, and the sadness when he disappears you know, when everything is Logopolis is falling apart. He wrote characters that you would invest in. They were fully rounded from the moment they appeared on screen, and you would invest in them totally. I mean, he even wrote Adric well. I mean, that's how good he was, and I felt that when he wrote Adric, that was some of the best performances that Matthew Waterhouse was able to give, because Adric was this fully rounded character in the hands of Chris Bidmead, and you would get, he would just, that eye for detail, because Logopolis and Castrovalva as well, but Logopolis, there is so much going on.
Do you think he felt a duty? Do you think he felt a duty to those characters, David, having not exactly created them as such, but been a key figure in bringing them to the screen? Not that he'd got to redeem anyone as such, but that he probably knew them better than anybody else and could reach into them and to flesh them out as well as flesh the stories out. Because with hindsight, you wouldn't think that a man like Christopher H. Bidmead, writing the other things that he was writing, would take the time to novelize all three of his stories for what was a children's book line.
Yeah, and Logopolis, there is more going on in Logopolis than, he's a fantastic prose writer as well. I mean, an interview I've heard, he's not very fond of reading science fiction. He thinks that he likes some of Philip K. Dick's ideas, but he said he was a terrible prose writer. I mean, you know, so he's not. He's got his opinions, but his prose was amazing too. But there is more going on in Logopolis than a standard Russell episode. And he pulls, you know, if you think of the end of season thing that Russell tries to do, or Russell has tried to do, and he'll throw a load of stuff at the screen and then he'll have a silly resolution.
Hope for the best, yeah.
Yeah. Christopher H. Bidmead is throwing all sorts at us. He's throwing chameleon circuits, he's throwing new characters, he's got Tegan, Aunt Vanessa the Master, the different planet keeping the universe alive. He's got the destruction of Nissa's world. He's got this character who's an in-between doctor, and it's Tom's last episode, so he needs to have to do that. He has to save the universe. He's got all this sort of stuff going on, and he pulls it together, and at the end, when the credits roll, you go, bugger me, you've done it. You know, and it's just an amazing 90 minutes of storytelling. And then he carries it on in Castrovalva. And it's that. And even having the courage in front of us, if I may just carry on, to put one of the main cast through a nervous breakdown because of a race memory of the Tractators, and showing Turlo, who go through a complete nervous breakdown because of that race memory, and having the courage to write that and to show it. Well, the guy was an absolute genius, and I don't think that the world of Doctor Who still probably isn't as appreciative of him as they should be. And I think
he moved on so quickly. I think too quickly. I believe that the show could have stood more of that, not necessarily taking any of that content any further, breaking down characters any further past that point would have probably been inappropriate. But I think that more of what he was doing, what he was mixing in, Gary, was actually not exactly taking the show places it hadn't gone before, but I think that it was really helping solidify it again with the target audience, and remind us that it was bigger than Tom Baker, that it was louder than Douglas Adams' voice, more idiosyncratic and more expansive than Philip Hinchcliffe's or Robert Holmes' take on the Who universe in that sort of gothic way. That it was bigger. You could go to different sort of phases and places, and that's why I describe it as almost elemental. He was succeeded by Anthony Reid as script editor, wasn't he?
Yeah, I know that he came back to do Castrovalva, and I think he script edited Kinda, as well. The one reason that I wish that he would have stayed on longer as script editor is because I think he's the one writer, even if it was just in the two stories, Castrovalva and Frontios, I think that he's the one writer that nailed the concept that Davison was an old man in a young man's body. And I so wish that they'd done more with that. And I think had Bidmead stayed on throughout Davison's first season and possibly beyond, I think that we would have got more of that. The scene in Frontios where Davison is examining that sick person and, you know, he has the half glasses on. I can't even tell you how much I love that scene. That is, even just with Davison wearing those glasses, kind of cements the idea that this is, you know, 1,000-year-old, you know, Time Lord. He just happens to look younger right now. And I think that Bidmead, who I think helped develop that idea, that's why I wish that, you know, he'd done more. I do want to say that in terms of what you just said, Dan, about that he's able to bring in concepts that really hadn't been seen in the show before. The fact that he can invest Logopolis with such an overwhelming sense of impending doom throughout its 4 episodes, and to me especially, and you showed the picture before, the long shot of the bridge, where we just see where we see the 4th Doctor of all doctors basically hanging his head in defeat as he listens to the Watcher tell him whatever he's telling him, you know, and then we see him in long shot gesticulating with the scarf blowing as, you know, the 4th Doctor is probably almost arguing with him. And it's like, what are they talking about? And the fact that right here you have the 4th Doctor, you know, the indomitable 4th Doctor kind of hanging his head in defeat and realizing that his end is near is incredibly powerful. And then in Castrovalva, where you see the newly regenerated 5th Doctor trying to hold it all together as his past incarnations bleed in, I think that you know, this is really an accomplishment, and the fact that Bidmead cannot make the story depressing, but we can still feel that sense of impending doom as the story goes on is, I just think, is tremendous. I used to not like Logopolis a lot because it didn't feel to me like a good capstone of the Gothic horror 4th Doctor, kind of an encapsulation of his entire era. But I thought, okay, but as an encapsulation of this entire season, the more science-oriented season, I think it's perfect.
Christopher H. Bidmead was a scientist, scientifically minded. You know, he would leave the show to go back to largely freelance writing on magazines like Personal Computer and PC World and Wired and all these magazines, a great many of which are still running today. And he'd be the founder of his own website in time as well, which was still publishing new articles until as recently as a few months ago. But he had a playful side too. I think he would often talk about his notions of swapping the Doctor out for a female incarnation played by Helen Mirren. Mainly, I think, as he would often remind us to reconnect with Miss Mirren because they dated in the 60s. I think I get the impression that he was somewhat burnt by that and wanted to to try and win her back in some way. But Helen Mirren as the Doctor would have been a pick for Christopher H. Bidmead. Mentioned it loads and loads of times. But there's lots of examples of him being more playful than you'd think. And I'm going to call this next segment the wit and wisdom of Christopher H. Bidmead. He was a lot more, being scientifically minded is one thing, but he wasn't afraid of the more sort of mundane advances, I suppose. I'm talking about social media. He embraced social media, enjoyed using X when it was called Twitter, and posted on his own 80th birthday. 80 years old. That's right. Twitter, rub it in, and an exclamation of despair. But he was very much part of a community over there. So he'd do what I would do. He'd tell dad jokes. He'd tell granddad jokes as well, Gary, which is exactly the kind of thing that I would do. He would make new friends even here, even if he was somewhat suspicious as to their motivations. He questioned Linda here whether she was interested in his time on Doctor Who, but he would also take to task his former employers, the BBC and TV licensing in particular there, as someone who was who didn't just talk the talk, walked the walk. And he was somewhat crusty. I think he underlined that reputation that he'd got, Anthony, that he didn't suffer fools gladly with some of that social media stuff, but always with a wink, you know.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't see some of these posts. So yeah, absolutely. I think his reputation before and then what he became as he became older, he certainly became a bit freer, didn't he, by some of those posts. What I think about that interview that I did when you showed those pictures, Dan, and about why he didn't do another year. I asked him that very question, and I said, well, why didn't you? And he said, well, I don't really know. He said that he didn't really know what the job was of that script editor on Doctor Who. So what he did was he said, I want a 30% pay rise. And that if you agree that 30% pay rise, we kind of get an understanding how important the script editor role is on the program. They said, well, him and Barry, John Nathan Turner and Barry Lett said, well, we don't really offer big pay rises like that across the department. We might be able to offer you 10%. And he said, well, no, I want 30 because I think that's what the job is worth, because I'm creating a whole series of television programs. And they said, no. And that was the defining moment where he felt that it was, according to that interview at that time, for me, that was the reason why he didn't do a further series of Doctor Who. Which is regretful, isn't it? Because that
very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. Obviously, we're talking here about the sad passing of Christopher H. Bidmead, writer and script editor on the classic series of Doctor Who, that so many of us grew up watching these stories, including people who've joined us in the live chat there on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook and X, dropping their comments and memories as well. So I think it's time we go and check in with them and see what they make of all of this so far. And what are their memories of not just those three stories, but that entire time? Yes, we've got several here. Great comments here. Thank you so much. First of all, Stephen Braddock has joined us on YouTube and says it's such a shame about Christopher H. Bidmead. He was so important to the direction of 80s Doctor Who. And David Mullen adds, Castrovalva and Logopolis fueled my imagination. See, these are very sort of Bidmead statements, aren't they? And were pivotal to getting me to watch the series. But Frontiers is perhaps his best written and captures his take on the Doctor perfectly. Obviously, it's got the added bonus to the fact that Davison had been playing the part for a little longer there too, Luke. So he wasn't so callow, wasn't so afraid of the part. I think Davison was initially afraid of the part. And so when you give him a story like that with so much going on, I mean, David correctly, I'm very definitely identified there some of the sophistication in that material, despite the fact there was rubber monsters, to keep an actor like Davison engaged, even though he too had decided to be leaving at that point. There was some great stuff in that season, and I do think that Frontiers is especially strong.
Yeah, and I think he said, didn't he, if the stories were like more like what they were in his last season, then he would have stayed. And that's talking about Frontiers and Caves of Androzani as well. Yeah. So it's a testament to the writing and the direction that everything come through at the end. But I mean, Peter Davison's a fantastic Doctor anyway, and this just cemented it even more. Funnily enough, we were at the con with Peter Davison on Sunday, because why not? And one of the Hooligans actors, Rob Peters, decided to ask him, in a convention full of Doctor Who fans and young Doctor Who fans, decided to ask him a question about his one appearance in Jonathan Creek. So says it all, really.
Did that go down well?
For Peter Davison, yeah, he had a great time. I can't repeat what he said because he wasn't very PG, but it went down very, very well. So,
Dom Goes joined us on YouTube and says that Logopolis is a giant of sci-fi. Thank you and rest in peace, Christopher. And Stephen says, I'll never forget the Watcher on the bridge, or Tom hanging from that radio telescope. Gary, just as you said there, those interactions, seeing his past flash before him, memories in stone. Bidmead was Shakespeare, adds Richard there in the live chat. And David has also joined us, just simple David, just one word. It's that guy he's the David from the film Prometheus, I think that's what it is. Evening All, says David, watching on YouTube. I remember getting the New Beginnings Master Trilogy box set when it came out when I was 11, and then seeing Logopolis for the first time, and I knew what a dark, mature story it was. The fact that people can watch these stories all these decades on, Anthony, and feel the way that I did when I first saw that. I was younger than David was here, but it stayed with me, and it still kind of haunts me, that story.
Yeah, and the comments here, Dan, in the chat, Bidmead would hate it, wouldn't he? If he was pushing for this scientific science fiction Doctor Who, some of these stories that people are recounting here, are magical tales, aren't they? There's something magical about these stories that people are reminiscing about, and which is a million miles away from probably what Christopher Bidmead wanted. But it creates that kind of that feeling that I think Stephen Braddock said just before there. This fueled my imagination. So that in itself is magical, isn't it? So that's great.
I believed it. I suppose you could say that the one magic he did believe in was the magic of television.
Yeah.
Has anybody actually ever heard the commentary on the DVD of Logopolis between him and Tom Baker when they're actually in? Because there's Christopher Bidmead is wonderfully explaining the stuff and anything like that, and you get the very occasional from Tom Baker is, what on earth is going on here? And you can almost just to sort of like have a sort of like little dig at Christopher Bidmead. You hear this frosty sort of, well, if you actually paid attention, Tom, what actually is going on is, I only used to read my bits of the script. That's you sort of that sort of frostiness was still there between them, and that commentary is one of, it's so funny in places.
I think you do find that with a lot of these commentaries. People, it's kind of like when families get together at Christmas or something. Or old school friends reconnected, a reunion, Gary. You find yourself slipping into the old dynamics. That's what I enjoy about some of these commentaries, just as David's described.
Yeah. I do want to say really quickly that, we're talking about, all this, how special his writing was. For me, my favorite line that he wrote for his 3 stories, and to me it's almost poetry, at the end of Castrovalva, when Shardovan says, "You made us, man of evil, but we are free." And then because I that line just every time. I love that.
What's fun for me, because I live quite close to Jodrell Bank, and so whenever I go past it, because I'm a Doctor Who fan, I think of Tom hanging off it, because it was such a good idea to have such an iconic sort of British science thing, such a good thing as a central part of the story, but obviously it was in Doctor Who terms, it wasn't Jodrell Bank, it was something else.
Pharaoh's Project.
But it's something that's still here now, and it's got that Doctor Who link, so when I go past it, I go, oh yes, there we go, there's a bit of Doctor Who.
Have you ever been tempted, Charlotte, to kind of break in and find the spot where the doctor fell?
No, I have been visit though. I have been in to visit, but we weren't allowed to get that close.
Oh, okay.
Tanindra Singh asks, still been driven mad by these questions. Where does the Watcher fit in? If the Valyard is the final incarnation, where does the Watcher fit? It's driving people mad after 45 years. Duncan the Funky Evans says Frontiers is an underappreciated story, but if you want to get really terrified by it, he suggests watch it in black and white.
Interesting.
I've never been tempted to do that. I think I might have to do that. Logopolis took a mega brain to write, says Domgo. I think it took somebody who must be very sure on where they were going to take that show and what they were going to do next. But Cesar of Diplos suggests that having Peter's Doctor in a coffin for part of his first story was just plain silly. I think it was the idea that I think I read somewhere or heard somewhere that was a deliberate thing as well, to gradually reveal the character to the viewers, because the kids had the shock of seeing the character change. And sort of, if the Doctor was running around the entire time, it might be too much. So if now and again you sort of open the lid to check that he was to check that he was still there, Anthony. It's a simple idea. It may well be silly, but it's Doctor Who. I like a bit of dash of silly.
I think if Doctor Who history corrects me right or wrong, I've got a feeling that the head of drama sent a memo down to John Nathan Turner about that very first episode of being too much in the TARDIS. And it was just a little bit too, I don't want to say dull or boring, because Bidmead's writing is never that. But I think the commentary from the upper floors of the BBC were saying, well, actually, the first episode is just set in the TARDIS. It's not exciting enough. And now you've got the Doctor in a box. Is that exciting enough? So some of the other commentary around perhaps wasn't as positive as we might see it, because I absolutely agree with you. You're developing the character, you're showing the character, and every time that coffin, for what the better word, that opening came down, you saw a glimpse of the Doctor. It was tantalizing, and then it went back up again. Yeah. So I kind of get a sense of why that's good. But I'm not sure everybody else viewed it like that. But I may have got that history completely wrong.
You could be right. David Mullen is also with us watching on YouTube and reminds us that it was Bidmead who first noted Russell T Davies was submitting a first draft material. He was jeered at the time. I know that Russell was submitting material from a very young age, wasn't he, to multiple people, specifically at Doctor Who. The furthest he got, obviously, was Mind of the Hodiak, 85, 86. Gary, which I know Big Finish have quite recently sort of adapted, because that went missing, didn't it? Any of the other things that Russell T Davies submitted, he insists are lost to the mists of time, or have long since been recycled, or whatever. But he would say that, wouldn't he? He would say that.
Well, I mean, if I was to ask to compare Bidmead's writing to RTD's, for me, it's no contest.
Yeah.
Stephen O'Neill says, I remember watching The Leisure Hive 45 years ago. I didn't like the new theme tune, preferred the original theme tune and Time Tunnel. I loved the reinvention of it at the time. And it got everybody to sit up and pay attention just at the right time. It had been stuck in a rut, in my view, but obviously everybody's different. I think obviously it's 40 odd years ago now. But Stephen, I love the scenes of a TARDIS within a TARDIS within a TARDIS. More nightmare fuel, I think, Luke. You see this stuff when you're in a formative phase. You think, well, it's a magic box. I know what it can do. It's bigger on the inside than the outside. And then it does something that you would never expect it to do. Haven't seen it done before. And
the fact it goes in and it gets darker and darker, and darker every time as well, and then you've got the muffled sound of the cloister bell going off in the background. You're like, ooh, this is not normal. It done something very different with it. Yeah, it was great. Yeah, absolutely phenomenal.
Apparently, Bidmead himself didn't want the flashbacks at the end of Legopolis. That was something that John Nathan Turner conceived of and insisted on. I think I'd heard that before too. Unimaginable to not have that as part of that story now, but there we are. That's the creative process for you. And finally, Richard Brooks adds, poor old Aunt Vanessa. Just like you said there, David. We still miss Aunt Vanessa and mourn her loss as well. Thank you for all those comments, all that interaction over on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X. Lots of personal takes on the stories and the man there, Christopher H. Bidmead. How much we knew about him then. Do we know a huge amount more now? Probably not, but I think that could be how we like it, how he liked it, to preserve that sort of mystique, Charlotte.
Yeah, so much to say, and it's sad that we keep losing these classic either script writers or actors, but we should just celebrate more than I think what they've contributed.